on to the special units. Now, I'll start out here because I said that the Knights of the White Wolf are the second best answer the Empire has to monsters and large units of monstrous infantry, which might make you wonder what could be better than a giant two-handed cavalry hammer for dealing with an ogre. Well, I'll tell you. What would be better is a demigryph with a knight on his back, wielding a halberd, or a lance and a shield. Now, here we have the Empire's proper anti-monster unit. First and foremost, they are riding demigryphs, which are incredibly ferocious little creatures. And while the knights on their backs are certainly very, very powerful men indeed, being some of the best and brightest of any knightly order the demigryphs are actually attached to, they are merely passengers. The real oomph of this particular unit comes in the demigryph, with an absolute ton of attacks, very high weapon skill and very high strength, with armor piercing, and the fact that, well, they are monsters and so they inspire fear in any unit they are fighting, and for damn good bloody reasons. They are one of the best anti-monster units in the Warhammer world, simply because they are ridiculously fast. They are pretty much always going to get the charge off against anything they are fighting. And while in melee combat proper, the knight on its back is more or less a passenger, that lance is really helpful on the charge. Because while the demigryph by itself has 3 strength 5 attacks, if you add in the knight, that adds in 1 strength 6 charge attack per model, meaning that a unit like this can actually just destroy a unit of ogres in moments. And the things that these monsters do to regular infantry, has to be seen to be believed. They are absolute threshing machines. They will chew their way through pretty much anything. Even Chaos Warriors will not want to be taking a charge from these guys head on, not even remotely. However, of course, being such a ridiculously powerful unit, they have quite a lot of limitations. Now, in fluff, demigryphs are, of course, stupendously rare, and actually having a demigryph which is tame enough to be ridden, well, first of all, it requires an incredibly good rider, and second of all, it requires an incredibly happy demigryph. Neither of which are easy to come by. Now, I kinda want to say that these units, in Total War terms, should be a special unit, either given to you through some event, or as a reward for some really big quest or something along these lines. At the same time, they're not that ridiculously rare, although they kinda are, so I'm not entirely sure on this one. What I would kinda like to see is that if your general is a Grand Master of a knightly order, and he gets to a really high level, so that he essentially gets maximum level. He has been in tons of battles, he's won tons of battles, he has killed absolute massive amounts of enemies, he's a super high veteran, proper super general. So if he actually reaches that level, you should be rewarded for taking care of your general, and thereby you should be allowed to start recruiting demigryph knights. Essentially, him being a master of the knightly order, he has access to some of the finest knights in the Empire, and therefore he has access to the people with the skills required to actually ride a demigryph. Now, even then, they should be somewhat limited. You should probably only be able to recruit one of these units every couple of years or something, just because it takes a hell of a long time to train a unit of demigryphs. And of course, they should be astronomically expensive, but it would be a really cool reward for actually taking care of your general, and then getting access to this really awesome elite unit that could then be used in the rest of your army. And additionally, If you've gone down the route of making your general a knightly order Grand Master, then you'll probably want him to be pretty much a combat general. And what better bodyguard than a unit of demigryph knights? Mount him on his own demigryph, or even a proper griffin, throw on some swanky magical gear, and you've got a ridiculously powerful melee unit, even the more ridiculous units of proper close combat races, like for example Chaos. Even Chaos Blood Crushers will think twice about accepting a charge from demigryph knights. Now, as for unit size, I'd probably say 5 models, which might seem like a lot just because of their sheer power, but these are supposed to be your premier anti-big guy unit, and so they need the numbers to deal with relatively numerous big guys like the ogres, and 5 of them should be reasonably able to deal with a 60 unit of ogres. And yet they're not that many to the point where they'll just, absolutely overrun anything and everything they get into contact with, and are still relatively liable to just getting swamped. So yeah, I think I would probably say 5 models per unit. Now, onto something slightly more normal, we have the greatswords. Greatswords are the elite bodyguard of elector counts and other generals. They are named after, well, the massive-ass sword that they prefer to use in melee combat, and wear full plate armor. They are among the finest warriors within the Imperial Army, and unlike the other elite branches of the Empire, they are open to, well, anyone, and usually consist of men who have conducted themselves with extraordinary bravery and skill in battle. And it is one of the few ways that a common-born might be raised into knighthood. An especially heroic greatsword may be knighted by their elector count as a form of reward. And this potentially incredible reward drives the greatswords to incredible acts of bravery in the hope of being recognized and thereby knighted, because that is by far the greatest honor that a common soldier could ever be afforded. And this means that, in tabletop terms, greatswords are very, 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 very hard to break indeed, and this should be represented in Total War Warhammer. Greatswords should have an incredible amount of morale. Breaking a unit of greatswords should be nigh on impossible. Like, you need to hit these guys from all directions at once to break them. If these guys are allowed to just hold the city street and not get flanked, they will stand there and they will die or win there. Now, their melee prowess, being some of the finest fighters in the Empire, is considerable. However, they are somewhat hampered by the simple fact that they do not carry a shield. Now, the fact that they carry full plate armor makes up for a lot of this, and as such they are not particularly vulnerable to neither melee nor ranged attacks. However, of course, the lack of a shield does leave them considerably more vulnerable than if they'd actually had one, but again, that sword's already heavy enough. Having a giant-ass piece of wood stapled to your arm probably wouldn't actually help you out all that much. And the sheer size and length of the sword is also quite useful as a defensive item. So, while it's not going to be blocking much arrow fire, in melee combat they are pretty goddamn resilient, because a combination of very heavy armor and a sword well suited for defensive and very powerful offensive fighting means that they should be an exceptionally good brawling unit. And of course, they're pretty damn good on the charge as well, though wearing full plate armor and that giant-ass piece of metal they call a sword, they're not particularly fast. Additionally, while the demigryphs and the Knights of White Wolves are certainly the best options for dealing with monstrous infantry, greatswords should not be sniffed at. Now, they're probably gonna have some problems dealing with proper big-ass monsters on other lines of dragons and bloodthirsters, but they will give any unit of ogres a serious run for their money, because while a normal sword might not bother an ogre too much, that big old thing is definitively a hell of a lot more dangerous. Now, as for their limitations though, greatswords, as I mentioned, are bodyguards of extremely important persons, elector counts or higher ranking generals, and being only the finest of the imperial crop, they are extremely limited in numbers, to the point where I would kinda like to say that you should only be able to recruit as many units of greatswords as you have characters in your family tree. And these characters should of course be at the very least general level, so per general in your family tree you can have 1 unit of greatswords. So if you had like 20 family members, you could technically make an entire army out of greatswords, but not entirely sure why you would want to. They're good infantry to be sure, but, you know, they're not particularly fast, they're slow, and while they can certainly deal with most infantry, they are going to get shot to absolute pieces while trying to, so I think that will kind of balance itself out, because of course having a couple units of these guys in an army is wonderful. That'd be an incredibly powerful and, more importantly, reliable central line unit. And of course, in siege offense and siege defense, having a unit that you can just simply plonk down a city street and have them just block any moves by your opponent is extremely useful. As for size, I would say let them have 120 members. It might be much, they might be better off at 60 members, just because they are considerably more powerful when it comes to dealing with big guys, but in the end they are just normal humans and they're not that well protected, so I'd probably say that 120 would be a good number. You can still deal with them, like they'll have problems against nice big charges of heavy cavalry or heavy archery fire, so yeah, I'd say 120 members sounds good. Now, on to something a little lighter, shall we? Because so far it's all been heavy infantry and heavy cavalry. The Empire is blessed in abundance with such things, but they also possess some damn fine light units. First up in the form of the Pistoliers. The Pistoliers are young nobles that haven't quite qualified for membership of a knightly order yet, and as such are extremely eager to prove themselves in combat. This makes them, to say the least, somewhat unpredictable, as being very young and very convinced of their own immortality, they might decide to do things that older, more veteran soldiers would consider extremely unwise, like, you know, charging head-on a unit of Chaos Warriors or something like that. But their primary role is not that of light melee cavalry, it is to be an extremely powerful and fast light skirmishing unit, of about 60 men, I'd say. They're armed with black powder pistols, which means, of course, that they are going to be doing quite a lot of damage, and they do have armor piercing, but they've got pretty damn short range, because these are fairly primitive pistols, and as such cannot be relied upon to all of that huge an extent, and ranges above 10-20 meters, really. Especially not when you're riding a horse. Now, they're relatively well armoured, considering their light cavalry in half plate, but their horses are completely unarmoured, so they will have some serious issues with arrow fire, and you should probably try to keep them out of the range of most ranged weaponry. However, the fact that they have pistols opens up a very interesting possibility. While most other ranged light cavalry have bows or some such ranged weapon of equal power, they're not going to be that much good at taking care of large units of monsters, like, for example, ogres. Pistoliers, however, having pistols, are able to inflict considerably more damage on nice big fat units of ogres. Though, of course, the ogres not being that slow either if they actually catch the pistoliers, or if the pistoliers decide that this is their one shot at glory and charge into melee, well, they're gonna go away really damn fast. You do, however, have a slightly more controllable version of the pistoliers called the Outriders. The Outriders are essentially the ones that are actually trying to teach the pistoliers how to be pistoliers, and are far more reliable, as they're not going to be stupid enough to charge off into melee for glory and riches and all of that nonsense. Additionally, they are blessed with some particularly fine pistols. They have repeater pistols, which are essentially 6-shot pepper pot type pistols. Now, this gives them a considerably higher rate of fire than your average pistoliers, although their reload time is also considerably longer, making them into a bit of a shotgun unit. You ride these guys up in front of an enemy unit, you unload a ton of pistol fire into them, and then you get the hell out of dodge. Now, being the older, more veteran members of the Pistoliers and having considerably more potent short-range firepower, they should probably come in units of 30. And even then, a unit of 30 Outriders will be able to put out more fire per volley than a unit of Pistoliers. But again, the same problem. While these guys might not be stupid enough to charge a unit of Ogres head-on, they're still not all that well protected, and so Archers and other ranged units are a serious hazard to them, especially as there's only 30 of them. The Empire Army also has some relatively fine light infantry in the form of the Huntsmen. Now, these are essentially locals that have been roped into military service as scouts. Being mostly made up of veteran huntsmen, they are pretty damn accurate with their bows, and having the scout special rule, they should be able to have guerrilla deployment. They should probably come in standard archer units of 120, but I'd kinda like to see them be unable to rank up properly. Basically just force them to be in skirmish stance at all times, because, well, that's what they are. They are a skirmishing unit. They're not a disciplined unit of archers capable of volley firing, for example. And while that might limit their potential worth in a total war game, they are still incredibly good skirmishers, because while most other races are going to have to rely on relatively short-range skirmishers, the huntsmen, having bows, can probably skirmish pretty damn well with pretty much all the other races. The only ones that would probably just give them a ton of trouble are the houers, as they have a unit that acts much in the same way as the huntsmen, except, well, they're better in every single goddamn respect, so that might be a problem. Now, for all of these units, I'd kinda like the same limitations when it comes to the recruitment. Pistoliers and huntsmen should be relatively limited. Now, pistoliers you should probably be able to recruit, though they should be relatively expensive because powerful. Outriders should be limited to the amount of pistoliers you have. For every 4 units of pistoliers you have total in your empire, you can have 1 unit of Outriders. And huntsmen should probably be limited to 1 or 2 per army. Because, well, they're not proper soldiers, they're not trained, they're just hunters that have been roped into military service, and a lot of them are not going to be too happy about it, so the ones who can actually sneak away from said civic duty will probably try. Then, to someone who is most definitively not going to be trying to sneak away from his civic duty, or in this case his religious duty, is the Flagellant Warband. Now, I must admit I'm not entirely sure on how to actually pronounce this. Flagellant or flagellant or whatever. Suffice to say, they're batshit insane religious fanatics who are convinced that they've done something horribly wrong, and the only way to redeem themselves is to throw themselves at the enemy while screaming extremely loudly, and taking as many of them with them as they can. Now, that might not sound like a particularly useful unit in military terms, and they kind of aren't, because, well, they're batshit insane, so they might not listen to your orders, precisely. and they're never ever going to understand the need for a tactical retreat. But on the other side, they are batshit insane religious fanatics, and so they are never ever going to run away, because, well, dying is their goal in life. That's how they think they can redeem themselves. And so they're a wonderful stopgap unit. I mean, throw this unit down a city street in a siege defense battle, and they're gonna sit there until they're all dead, inflicting considerable damage on whoever tries to outgrind them in the process. In open field battles, though, the simple fact that they don't wear any armor would mean that they are extremely vulnerable to the good old-fashioned arrow to the face tactic. And while you could kind of use them as a meat shield, well, flagellants should probably not be a recruitable unit. They should probably occur from events and such things, since, well, you don't train a flagellant, they're just crazy people that show up from time to time, and so using a relatively rare and unrecruitable unit as a pure meat shield, sure, could do it I suppose, but they'd certainly be far more useful as a nice big melee breaking unit to halt the enemy's particularly nasty elites. Or of course in a siege defense where they could choke up city streets for a very long time indeed. But enough with this silliness of infantry. On to something far more interesting, namely the artillery. We start out with the workhorse of the Empire's artillery park, the Great Cannon. Now, these things should probably come in units of 4 cannons, I'd say, and would work, well, essentially like cannons have always worked in Total War games. Not too much strangeness here, really. As for misfire, well, these are just basic cannons. They're going to be doing damage, but they're not going to be doing that much damage, so I don't really see the need to nerf them with a misfire chance. I'd say they should probably work like Total War artillery always has worked. They keep firing and they don't have any real chance of blowing up and destroying the unit. And the question of artillery balance in a game like this has come up a few times. Like, how do you balance a faction like the Empire, who relies so heavily on artillery? Well, you do it by, of course, nerfing some of the more powerful artillery batteries with, for example, misfires, or very low ammunition pools, etc. But in many of these cases, it's not the artillery that actually needs the nerfing. Take the Great Cannon, or the Imperial Mortar, for example. Now, these two units are very, very simple units. They're a cannon, and they're a mortar. They should come in units of 4 and act pretty much the same as they've always done in Total War games. But while they, in Total War games previously, might have been a little bit too powerful, that's not the fault of the artillery pieces themselves. It's the fact that they're extremely hard to counter with anything except counter battery fire, because any intelligent opponent is going to be defending his valuable artillery, and so it's going to be pretty damn hard to actually get at them with cavalry. But this is a hell of a lot easier to deal with in a Warhammer game, because you have so many more options. First and foremost, Warhammer light cavalry is in many cases considerably more potent than the normal light cavalry of our own timeline. You have Elvish light cavalry, who can be relied on to deal with most units in a straight-up fight, and so defending the cannons are going to be a hell of a lot harder. You've got lots of light cavalry with extremely potent range weapons. Again, you have elves with incredibly powerful elvish bows, and being elves, they don't miss much. You have flying units, which could simply just jump on top of your artillery, butcher a bunch of dudes, and then go screaming off into the sky again. Or you've got ambushing units that could show up behind your army, forcing you to dedicate a rather considerable part of your army to actually protect against that. Or you have infiltrating units, like the Skaven Gutter Runners, who could sneak up and do all kinds of horrible things to a nice, shiny, bright, and beautiful artillery park. You've of course got tons of other artillery pieces who can deal with most other things. Even the orcs and goblins have access to a considerable amount of artillery. And then of course there's magic. Now, while just simply throwing a nice big fireball into the midst of a bunch of cannons is going to do the job nicely, there are also plenty of protective spells that are actually quite capable of dealing with cannonballs. You place a ward spell on your prized units of heavy cavalry, and a lot of those cannon shells are not going to be doing any damage. Or maybe you have more powerful battlefield-wide spells. You can make it rain, for example, which impairs cannons. Maybe you could even have some terraforming spells, where you could create a canyon for your cavalry to travel down in safety, or maybe create a little bit of a hill in the way. There are so many more potential ways to deal with artillery in a Warhammer game than in traditional Total War games, so I think we need to be careful about all the doom and misery until we actually know what they're going to do with them. So, on to some of the more insane artillery pieces, shall we? Because the Great Cannon and the Mortar, well, they're basic things. Something that's not nearly so basic is the rare units section, where we have the Hellblaster Volley Gun. Oh my, the Hellblaster Volley Gun. Love it, hate it. There are many different views on this beautiful piece of engineering. And in tabletop it's so damn powerful that just deploying one of these things on one of a flank can pretty much make that an automatic no-go zone for your enemy. Now, this one is a little bit problematic in Total War terms, but I think you could balance it reasonably simply. First and foremost, the Hellblaster Volley Gun, as you can see, has 9 barrels. So the first and most obvious way to balance this is simply to say that it can fire 9 times. Or, well, 3 times, technically, because the way the Hellblaster Volley Gun works is that those 9 barrels are on a rotating axis. So essentially the top 3 cannons are fired simultaneously, then the barrels rotate and the next 3 barrels fire simultaneously, and then the last 3 fire simultaneously. So essentially you'd have 3 shots of 3 cannonballs each. And after that, reloading the Hellblaster Volley Gun in the field is pretty goddamn impossible. Well, you could do it, but it takes an absolute insane amount of time, because each of the barrels needs to be reloaded individually. So what I would kind of like to see is to have this thing be on the board as, let's say, 2 models. It gets to fire relatively quickly, gets to fire all of its barrels, with a misfire chance of 10%, shall we say, per set of barrels. Now, it can never misfire on the first shot, because that shit's just annoying. But every shot after the first one has a chance of misfiring. Now, the misfire could be anything from the gun just, explodes to it stops working, or it needs to be fully reloaded before it can actually fire again. Now, if it misfires to the point of the gun blowing up, that does not mean that the unit is destroyed, okay? That is very important. These are expensive, good units, and you cannot allow them to just go away because of a roll of the dice. If the unit explodes, it is considered dead for the remainder of the battle, but as long as you win the battle, you essentially salvage it, it's rebuilt, and it's ready for the next battle again. And this would make it a little bit easier to balance. Now, let's say it can be reloaded on the battlefield, but it's going to take absolutely forever, to the point that if you ever eat 2 full barrages of a Hellblaster Volley Gun, you've really only got yourself to blame. Because with a cannon that's going to take like 6-7 minutes real time to reload, well, if you've been stupid enough to sit there in front of it for almost 10 minutes, then you probably deserve what's coming to you. The Hellblaster Volley Guns are pretty damn rare, but they're not that rare. The Imperial Forges of Newland can produce a fair number of them, so they should be recruitable, although from a relatively high-tech building. And they should be relatively expensive, but otherwise they should be recruitable. If you want to have like 5 of these things, just place them out in the front of your army, then go ahead. Though, of course, in multiplayer terms they should be even more expensive, to the point where in an average-sized game, if you've actually bought 5 Hellblaster volley guns, well, then that's all you've got too, so good luck. Anyways, on to the potentially even more destructive artillery piece, the Hellstorm rocket battery. A little bit of a funny story. The Hellstorm rocket battery is not named Hellstorm because of the massive amount of wonderful missiles it can fire off, but from the extremely impressive string of unfathomably graphic and profane curse words used by the Elector Count of Middenheim at the engineer demonstration of the rocket battery that almost killed him. And considering that the Elector Count was standing at a pretty safe distance behind the rocket battery, that should give you a rough indication as to its accuracy. In Total War terms, this thing should essentially be the embodiment of the good old saying, if you throw enough mud at a wall, some of it's gonna stick. I would like to see it fire its rockets in just one giant discharge of just screaming rockets just whooshing off against the enemy. But all of these rockets are ridiculously inaccurate, to the point where if you fire all 9 rockets at an enemy army at max range, fully ranked up and 3 ranks deep, and probably only 3 of them are actually going to be hitting the enemy army. Luckily, unlike the Hellblaster volley gun, the Hellstorm rocket battery is a bit quicker to reload, so it should probably have a reload time of about a minute or something along those lines, maybe a minute and a half, so that you should be able to at least get off 2 full volleys of them, and they should come in units of 4. Now, that might sound like it's an incredibly dangerous and perhaps even overpowered unit, but here's the thing. While a mortar can be fired into melee with at least some hope of not murdering the vast majority of your own guys, the Hellblaster rocket battery will become extremely dangerous to even think of firing at anything but extreme ranges. Because while at the extreme end of its considerable range, at the very least you're guaranteed not to hit your own men, if the enemy army starts to get within charging distance, or even just arrow fire distance, you're running the considerable risk of a fair good deal of those rockets hammering into your own guys. And so would be a very, very cool risk-reward kind of weapon. Now, of course, it would require considerable amounts of actual in-game testing to determine just how to do this, and since, well, I don't have access to the game for some ridiculous reason, it's pretty damn hard for me to just try and approximate its power level, but you know, it should be pretty damn powerful, because like the Hellblaster volley gun, it should be pretty damn expensive. And you want it to be good, because, I mean, look at it. It's beautiful. Is a medieval Katyusha, and you certainly want it to be worth the amount of investment you're probably going to be put into it. So I don't think it's going to be that big of a problem to balance. As to whether or not it should have a misfire chance, again I'd probably say that on the first barrage it should not have a chance to misfire. On the second one, sure, throw in a 10-20% chance of misfiring, and use the same rule as the Hellblaster. If the model should blow up, then it's back in business the next battle, as long as you actually manage to win the battle. If those two have been relatively simple to balance, now we come to something that's definitively not simple to balance. Namely, the steam tank. And yeah, it's a steam tank, so you can already see some potential problems in this thing's balancing, considering the vast majority of the other races in the Warhammer world are going to be lucky if they've got gunpowder weaponry. And as you can probably imagine, shooting at this thing with arrows is going to produce very little except a long series of rather disheartening plinking noises. And on that note, is it really a tank? Well, yeah, it kind of is. Those are pretty damn thick pieces of armor you're seeing there, so Like, penetrating this thing with a sword or a spear or anything, yeah, it's just not gonna happen. It is essentially immune to most melee weapons. Like, you need an ogre with a two-handed greatsword to actually get through this thing in melee. And, well, as you can see, it's got a cannon on the front, which is, of course, capable of being loaded with grape shot, so, yeah. So, how would you actually implement this damn thing? Well, that's a complicated question. I think the simplest way is just to say that it's non-recruitable at all. You can only get it through an event, like you get one of these during your entire playthrough. One. If you get it killed, well, that's it, say bye-bye to your Steam time. And then make it pretty damn ridiculously powerful, like you're going to need artillery of some sort to actually deal with this thing. Even then though, a couple of rock lobbers, if they get some proper hits in on this thing, they are going to take it out relatively quickly. It's just that, well, you're not going to be dealing with this thing in melee unless you happen to be playing ogres or something. Which kinda makes me think that maybe they should just skip this one, which makes me a little sad, because it's a cool unit, but really don't know how... I don't think you could balance this thing in a Total War sense. I don't think you could actually do that. And definitely not in a multiplayer sense. It would have to be a strictly campaign unit. So, I'm not entirely sure. Either you should just be able to have one of them and then make it really powerful, or they should just not do it, because, well, yeah, Steam Tank. A little bit problematic. Last two units are some fairly unique ones. First up, you have the Luminarch of Hish. Now, this thing is, well, exactly what it looks like. It's a death laser. And, well, yeah... it's a death laser. What more do you want to know? It uses the power of celestial magic to focus a beam of light into a giant-ass laser. Now, in Total War terms, that isn't quite as ridiculously hard to balance, I think, as it might sound. Basically, it's a single model unit. It fires extremely slowly, but it fires extremely powerfully. It fires in a straight line into the enemy at a relatively considerable angle, so it's only ever likely to hit one rank of units, so it would kind of work like a bolt thrower really, except a really cool bolt thrower, firing lasers instead of boring old ass sticks of wood. So despite the fact that it's a death laser, if you just implement it as essentially a bolt thrower, I think it could be done relatively easily. So, all in all, I think you could implement it as a cool unit with some limited use. I mean, it's awesome, don't get me wrong, and it would just ignore armor to an even greater degree than your average ballista, but in the end, essentially a bolt thrower, just cooler. Then, the last unit is the Celestial Hurricanum. This one is a bit of an interesting one, because I would like for it to be used as, well, kind of a mage, really. Now, in tabletop, this thing is essentially a mount for a wizard lord using the lore of havent. What it does is, it gives a 1 bonus to hit in close combat in a relatively small area of effect, not that useful. But here's the cool thing, it calls down little hurricanes on the enemy. Now, these hurricanes, however, are not artillery attacks, and when I say hurricanes, I'm not talking like Katrina levels of just destroying everything on the battlefield. Essentially, it would hit like, well, a catapult, say. It would kill 4 or 5 dudes per hit, but nothing horrifying. But here's the interesting thing. It doesn't work like an artillery piece, it works like a mage. The little hurricane is not a projectile, it's a bound spell, so you can cast this spell every single turn and it can be dispelled by your enemy. If they do magic purely as artillery and don't implement any magic system really, then I'd probably say that they should just ignore the Celestial Hurricanum, because the Luminarch of Hish would essentially do the same job, and be more, well, logical, if you can call the giant death laser in Renaissance Europe logical. But if they add a proper magic system with the ability to dispel enemy spells, etc., the Hurricanum could be a really cool unit, because you're forcing your enemy to be dispelling essentially free spells produced by the Celestial Hurricanum, or watch as it fires like 3 or 4 small tornadoes into your army, which, like I said, would work much like a catapult. It wouldn't be a mass destruction thing, but you've got the option. Do you continuously keep using your limited amount of dispel resources to stop the Celestial Hurricanum, or do you let it do its thing to your army while you concentrate on bigger, badder things? It could either be a really cool unit with some interesting tactical possibilities, or it could be a very basic, kinda boring unit, depending on what they want to do with magic. Now, I think that's going to be all for me, because, well, this video has already gotten uncomfortably long, to the point where I might split it up into 2 parts. I'll see, once I'm done editing and everything, I'll probably shorten it down a bit. Anyways, I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, I hope to see you next time, and have a good day.